Okay, hi everyone. My name is Edgard Dewitte, not Edward. This one anyway. I am at Oxford, and I'm super happy to be here. It's obviously one of the best crowd I can have for this paper. Really, we're looking forward to your comments. It's a paper that circulated for the last few years, so I think a few of you have seen it already. This winter I did some extra data collections. I'm really planning to submit this during the summer, so all comments are very welcome. That's the time, preferably there than during the referee report. So,
like Raquel, you can threaten your future referees here.
No, but I'm very nice. Okay, so the title is Economic Identities and the Historical Roots of Climate Change Attitudes. And the motivation for this paper is quite striking, or at least I find quite striking fact that about 40% of Americans declare not believing in climate change. And not only the share is pretty high, it's been stagnant or very slowly increasing over the last 30 years since it's been surveyed. Despite obviously very increasing awareness and understanding of the issue. And the current scholarship that's working on this is not very able to explain this kind of stagnant pattern. Why? First, because people have looked at climatic events, and what they found is that it gives a very kind of short effect on attitudes. And of course, it's a very partisan issue, and partisanship play a role, but even within partisan group, there's a lot of variation, and it wasn't a partisan issue, or at least way less than now, 10, 15 years ago. Right? So in a sense, we don't really understand what is underlying formation of belief about climate change. And what this paper is trying to do is that it's trying to shift the attention a bit away from climate change, which for many people is still quite invisible, towards what climate change is really questioning, which is the use of fossil fuel. And fossil fuel, on the opposite, are they are ubiquitous, especially for communities that are built around their production. And maybe that's known for some of you, but the US has the longest and largest history of extraction of fossil fuel. By far, for the 160 years, it's been one of the largest producers, if not the largest producer. And something we're going to see together today is that it's an extremely widespread production. About 3/4 of US counties have seen an oil and gas well drilled in their ground. And what's been documented mostly quantitatively is that, of course, the industry had major economic impacts to the communities in which it developed, but also strong cultural impacts. And in particular, it created something that one could call local economic identities or oil identities. And I'm going to be specific what I mean by this, but you think of a cultural attachment to the resource, and you can think of several ways to which this type of attachment impact the formation of beliefs. At least this is the question I'm asking today. I'm asking, can long-run histories of fossil fuel extraction, through in particular these local cultural attachments, can impact present-day beliefs about the climate? Answer is going to be yes. I'm going to try to convince you of this in 3 main steps. The first one is I'm going to show you that there is a strong causal relationship between a history of extraction and present-day beliefs in climate change. And I'm going to do that importantly controlling for present-day exposure to the resource, which is obviously a major confounder, but also for many other things that you could think play a role, like a bundling of ideology. Maybe it's not just specific to climate change beliefs, it's a general ideology. I'm going to try also to kind of look at some question of selection into those areas. So I'm going to really try to convince that the places themselves have an impact on individuals. I'm going to do that, I should have mentioned that before, using data on virtually the universe of oil and gas wells that have been drilled in the US since the 1860s. And now that I've kind of tried to establish that places have an impact on individuals, the question is, well, how are these places different, right? And here is my argument about fossil fuel identities. And I'm going to document that using a bunch of archival data, and I'm going to try to also document why those identities arise. And here my argument is really going to be about the public good provision that firms and the industry in general has been providing to those places. And to kind of tie the whole story together, and this is what I'm still working on a little bit, I'm going to try to show that variation in where those identities develop within those oil extractive places, impact really is what is tied to the variation in beliefs today. So really kind of pushing forward my mechanism. Okay.
The error that I was expecting, obviously, was one depending economically on oil, but that's basically what.
Yeah, here, this is kind of conditional on oil exposure today. Yes. Okay. Yes, sorry, please.
I have a question. Should we think that the oil industry has something special, or if you were to look at other industries, say for example, Turkey was paying the employees more, and so now we have there to.
No, thank you for the question. It's usually, I mean, it's going straight to my conclusion. So I'm happy to talk about it now. Definitely, this is not specific to oil and gas. Both, if you think in terms of climate change beliefs, right? There are other industries, maybe a bit less in a less salient fashion, but there are other industries that are very CO2 oriented that could develop some form of attachment, right? The meat industry, the car industry, aviation, right? Obviously, you need to account for those to get the 40%. Even if I do back of the envelope calculation with my special case here, I get substantive numbers, but not the 40%, right? So you need to account if you want to think about the big picture. But also, obviously, not even thinking about climate change beliefs, right? What this paper, and in a sense, it's a good jump to my literature review. Of course, kind of straightforwardly, I contribute to the literature on climate change beliefs. But the second thing I'm doing is that I'm trying to bring an explanation that is centered around what I call economic identities, which of course is something documented by sociologists before, but maybe the econ literature has been overlooked that when they've been thinking about national identity, religious identity, etc., right? But in a sense, attachment to a local industry, or even the consumption behavior, is really kind of probably impacting a lot of behaviors and beliefs, right? And I think this is why indeed this is a specific case, but it has a general application for sure. Yes.
Yeah. So when you say belief in climate change, that is caused by fossil fuels, right?
So it's a very good question. So it is indeed implicit in that. I'm tending to actually going towards more, actually not talking about beliefs, but attitudes. I still have to think about it. Why? Because it's quite hard to really disentangle those different layers, right? So you can ask a question, and the survey I'm using is actually to some extent distinguishing between those things. You see that there is a small but existing fraction of people that do state climate change is a thing. It's happening, but it's not caused by humans. But this tends to vary very much the same way as these other beliefs. And of course, again, go back to your question, this is all with the implicit thinking that when you talk about climate change, no, it's very salient that you talk about fossil fuel generated, so human-made climate change.
If it's not the case, then it could be that they don't necessarily have different beliefs on climate change or this but it could have different opinions on how important that is to them. Right? And if you we are really the benefits a lot, we have to think that benefit is outweighs the risk.
Yeah. No, 100%. And this is the reason I'm saying it's a bit hard to disentangle is both because depending on the survey you use, and I'm using different existing surveys, and they ask the question differently. And sometimes it's more about the importance of the issue and how much we should do about it. And sometimes it's about, do you actually believe it? But it's also because you see an impact on both kind of what I'm showing. You see an impact on the propensity of people to say, believe in the existence of the issue, and on their propensity to think of to what extent we should do something about it or it's important. Right? So this is why, exactly to that point, I think at least the paper here is more talking about attitudes, and it's going to be cleaner to have a bit of a general vision of the attitudes and not thinking about the exact form of beliefs that people have.
Because whether the beliefs are different because we choose to believe something which is society or which is consistent with what we have economy or incentives. Whether your beliefs are different because in your region there are vested interests who are wanting information and some of
Yeah, 100%. But this is, in a sense, that is more where this paper is going to. It's trying to show that it's not purely related and actually way less than one we think, but this is not necessarily a claim, but it's not only related to the economic material interest you have in the resource. And one thing I can try in one result to give you a sense of that is that even in regions where the industry is gone, whether the production industry or even I build a lot of measures of all other downstream industries that take the inputs of the industry, even in those regions, the history of oil still matters. Places with a longer history have a different attitude. Okay, thank you for the comments. This is just to say, well, in a sense, I'm bringing to this existing literature on the historical roots of attitudes, the question of climate. And in a sense, what I'm contributing here is hopefully that with this idea of economic identities or identities in general, which of course I'm not the only one to discuss, you kind of understand a little bit better why something persists and some things don't, which is obviously a key existing puzzle of this literature. Okay, yes.
Have the opportunity to address this with exposure to the negative effect of climate change, like catastrophes or so?
Yeah, so I have at some point I have a control on indeed the existing, not only damage so far, but forecasted impact of climate. It's very orthogonal. Right? The only thing I could say on that is that if you have definitely only if you have a very strong negative impact of fossil fuels, which is the only thing that we have in the US, and that is the oil spill in the Gulf, right? The BP oil spill, then you might have something that is, tempering this impact of oil and gas industry.
The more wildfires or so,
I mean, it matters, but completely orthogonal to this story. But what papers have shown is that the wildfires matter temporarily. So if you survey people the week after, they're going to be, yes, maybe it's an issue. 6 months after, they forgot about it, and they're back to the kind of steady state beliefs, which I'm trying to explain a bit more here. Yes.
You think it's historical? You mean that they need no longer be involved, that community, in oil possibilities?
Yes.
At all?
Yes.
Okay.
But they are, of course.
Well, then it's not historical. It's
Yeah.
current. I mean, I'm just trying to make a differentiation between historic. And even, if it's current, you obviously don't want to be blamed for something, but even if it's historical, you may not want your families, etc., or someone who's living in you don't want to be blamed for that. I guess I'm putting that because I'm going to push back against identity.
I see.
Because I see too much identity in papers now. And I'm gonna say I don't know that it's identity. It could just be guilt.
No, I think you're right. I think the question is, of course, whether we're thinking about the exact psychological mechanism that's at play, or whether you're thinking about what is the visible element that is impacting this mechanism. And what I mean by that is that definitely guilt could be part of the story, but in this case, for instance, very few people were actually immediately employed by the industry. What's interesting, and it's actually why I'm focusing on oil and gas and not coal. The coal industry is the exact same story, and the results are the same. But what's interesting about oil and gas is that the fraction of people that are actually immediately employed and involved in the area, in the industry, is very small. And so if you're experiencing guilt or some form of, not willing for the industry to be blamed, if your family and yourself haven't been immediately involved in the extraction, it has to be because you feel an attachment still. And this is what I mean by a local identity. Maybe, super happy to take
It could be, I don't know, I'm just going to throw out things.
Yeah.
Tax revenue. What fraction of tax revenue comes from the oil and industry? And therefore, the schools and the hospitals, what bears the name? Exxon did blah, 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 founded this hospital.
This is exactly my story. So maybe what I should not say is use the word identity. I'm just saying, no, but I mean.
You get Rachel Cranton, she'll love you.
I talked to her last week. She was very excited. That's true. But maybe I don't get Rachel. No, but I think what the reason why I'm flexible in the naming is because I think the naming is not essential to the mechanism. And so I think an attachment is a proper word. Whether it is because you have just a set of positive opinions with respect to the industry, that as long as they are kind of historically rooted and not just because today you have a clear material interest into it, I'm fine. And the public good provision of those firms is 100% what is going to help building these identities. Yes.
just building on Nadir's point, I think one thing that could help you separate out whether it's sort of economic impact and its identity story is that it's the social aspect of it. So say if you have someone who was born there and they started with this beliefs, and then the moment when they move out of the community and they sort of lost this identity, so if you could show that kind of evidence, then it speaks to this identity literature that it's really a collective identity.
So no, so you're completely right. The issue is that it's very hard to get panel data with movers surveying surveys before, beliefs before and after, right?
You don't need to have a panel.
Okay, so you think I can just look at the movers and see, no, you're right. And I have some data on, so I use it to kind of show that in migration is not driving, but you're right that out migration, studying out migration could help a bit understanding the mechanisms. Yes, true. Okay, that's the outline. We've talked a lot already and reviewed some of the results, so maybe I'll skip some, but very straightforward. These are the 3 steps that I just showed in the introduction. Very quick background so that you fix IDs. Oil and gas industry in the US could be characterized by 2 main features, at least 2 main that are interesting in my case. First, there's a very large and easily accessible endowment. So this is why it's been such a big producer since the mid-19th century and the first one. So you have oil fields across the entire country. And there's an interesting part of the institutional kind of property rights dimension of the US, which is that there is private ownership of subsurface minerals. So that means that it's not a big government entity that is taking care of extraction. It means that if you own a plot of land, you own the land below, and hence what happens is that there is a very widespread private exploration in oil. Once oil is found, this is what happens, right? It's like immediately you see all plots of land trying to get some oil because, in particular, because of this idea, which is the law of capture, which states that any resource that you extract from your ground, not just that is lying below, because of course with oil, how do you know where it's lying? Any resource that you extract from the ground is yours. Right? So this is how it shows. This is Texas in 1910, but like if you want a bigger picture, this is my data on oil and gas wells, and you see that it's extremely widespread across the country. And what you see here already that I'm showing, which is an important distinction, the red dots are the producing oil and gas wells. The gray ones are those that were drilled, but never actually produced commercial quantities. They were intended for it, but they were not successful. And it's a US specific thing, right? It's 60, US is here. US in 2005 was 9% of world production, but 60% almost of active ones. So the data I use is I'm mostly relying on this well data. Why? Because it is the more comprehensive historical data. You don't get good production figures historically. Employment is at the decennial level, and of course, as I said, it's very low employment industry, so it doesn't get much of variation. But I complete with the data with a lot of present day local production and employment data, as you can see. For the wells, we're going to discuss if needed, but for the wells, I have a lot of different elements. Production status and operators are going to be quite important. And on surveys, as I mentioned, I use a bunch of surveys, but the main one, the results you're going to see today is mostly on using the CES, which is this big survey run in the US still today, but has an interesting question about climate change between 2006 and 2012. And the survey is great because it's a very large sample and it's covering a lot of the counties. Like 96% of counties are covered. For those that might say be skeptical, I think this crowd is fine with that, but skeptical about surveys, and I take your question in a second. I show that at the county level, those beliefs, they do correlate with some form of behaviors you would expect from people that do not have strong attitudes pro-climate change, right? So they buy less electric vehicles, they give less to green tax, they vote less for green ballot initiatives at the state level, things like this. Yes.
So you're also going to show us like a map for the deposits, like oil, and maybe also even a historical map for that.
So I want, and the reason is the following. Of course, very intuitively, also when I started this project, I was like, great, the good thing about working on this type of resource is that you can instrument to some extent with the existing resources. The issue is that historically, that is not a feasible thing because the actual reserves in terms of accessible reserves, depend a lot on the technology. So if you want, it's very hard to say, something that is today accessible reserve for oil and gas wasn't the case before the invention of fracking, for instance, right? And this is the truth. So you would have kind of a weird setup where you need for every existing small variation in technology, existing accessible resource. So what I'm using instead, and this is also a good transition to here, I'm using another thing. So the variation I'm interested in is the cross-county variation, not only in the presence of oil, but also on the length of exposure, right? This is back to my my argument. And the feature I'm going to use, because I cannot use those deposits, is the uncertainty of drilling. Because what I observe, as I mentioned, is that I observe whether a well is successful or not. And in fact, for the large part of the century, a lot of wells weren't successful because the science to really know whether oil and gas was to be found in a certain place was very poor, right? So when I say a lot, it's about a third of the 4 million wells that I have in my data are unsuccessful. About 173 counties have been drilled unsuccessfully, and these are going to be kind of a straightforward control counties. And what's interesting, I bring a lot of anecdotal evidence to kind of back that up. I also show that to some extent quantitatively with the correlates that I had at the time. Then I'll take the question in a second. But what you can say is that not only the presence of oil once you've drilled is unclear, but also how long are you going to be able to extract the resource. So the length of extraction post drilling is also quasi-random, and I cannot show that.
Yeah.
One question, please go on. If you want to follow up on your question,
I was
please.
just curious, because looking at the actual wells, they do have a lot of problem, right? It's like it's first a decision to take if you want to drill or not. And there's some places you just can't, like if you're living in the city in an apartment building, you obviously cannot dig a hole around, right?
Yeah.
So it's gonna be like
Yeah.
homesteading counties where you get a lot of land, then that's gonna be correlated with many things like.
Well, but that's the point. I think this is exactly the point of taking only the unsuccessful counties as a control group, because de facto what's going to happen is that these are the counties in my sample. The gray are the controlled and successful ones, and the dark are those that actually had oil and gas. And indeed, many of that takes away a lot of places like the Northeast, which didn't have oil both for kind of practical reasons, but also because it's not the same type of setup to drill. But in a sense, I want to stress also that oil is such a valuable resource that even if it's below a building in New York, people would drill for it. That's yes.
I guess it's less relevant given this map, but like you were describing it as like so decentralized and all these small wells. Like, how is the data collected on unsuccessful on these dry wells? Like, I'm surprised that there's even records.
Well, there is records of that because because it's a valuable resource. Quite quickly, states try to organize some form of register of where oil was drilled. One reason, of course, is that apart from a few places, it's still land that is owned by people, right? And so there's kind of leases that have to be signed, and those kind of official documentation to some extent is well recorded. But of course, I don't have the absolute universe of unsuccessful wells pre-1900. It's been actually a lot of, so the data source is in part a private entity that is collecting this data for the firms, but a lot of archival work on my side to make sure that the coverage on this pre-period that no one cares about is decent, right? It's not extremely exhaustive, but it's pretty good. Because then you can cross the exact number of wells is not important, so you can cross accounts of whether people actually search in an area to my data to see, okay, is this area treated to something? Yes.
Just clarifying, are there any adverse consequences of that when it comes to if you start, but then it doesn't work out, you get all the costs without the benefits?
Yeah, so the concept completely. Now you have the point is that then you abandon the place. It's like the process of trying to drill a well doesn't involve a large settlement that would mean that there is kind of resistance of these unsuccessful communities. But good point. Okay, so that's my variation. That's the same map I showed you before, but also with the length of histories, right? And this is really key, and you see that even in kind of oil-intensive regions, from one country to another, you have like very different length of extraction, meaning number of decades during which there is oil and gas extraction. And I'm plotting that in a very straightforward RLS, where I have a belief on the left-hand side, the oil exposure on the right-hand side, and then a bunch of controls. Now, and it's actually an open discussion which one I should put, in the sense of many of them are going to be bad controls, right? Because they come ex post of the treatment of finding oil, but they're going to be able to rule out a bunch of hypotheses. What's important to note is that I have worked with state fixed effects, so I'm really comparing two counties within the same state, and in particular, two counties with the same level or similar level of present day exposure. So here there is a bunch of things I do, and we can look at them if you want, but bear in mind that in all setup, my results are robust, whether you think of grouping counties, because of course it's also a very bad control, right? The prediction today is correlated to the history, and it's ex post. But if I plug the variable itself in the regression, my coefficient is very little impacted. You're going to look at the results. But this is true even if I do matching or grouping, and if I focus, as I said before, on counties with no prediction. Yes.
Do you know whether there is a relevant variation in eminent domain? Whether the state was allowing more firms to.
So there's two forms of variation that I don't know which one you're thinking about, but yes, there is first of all a variation in who owns the land, and in kind of public land, there's been a bunch of rules, for instance, of who can drill. And kind of unsurprisingly, in those places, I see an effect, but less of an effect. Then it's a bit more tricky in terms of the rules that evolve over time, in terms of proration of kind of control of the industry. Let me defer the answer because that's going to be related to my last part. I think that's relevant. Okay, results, baseline. As I mentioned, in this case, one standard deviation of number of decades of exploration, which is about 3.2 decades, decreases by 0.7 percentage point your probability to believe in climate change, or to have favorable climate change attitudes. Now, this is a county level variable impacting an individual. If you compare it to other determinants, that's what I write here, this is roughly the same magnitude, if not more, than the variation in the county's share of votes for Republicans at presidential election. So it is pretty sizable, I think, at least in comparative perspective. And here is where I add those kind of present day county controls, which kind of have a lot, I take your question, Sam, which have a lot of different dimensions, whether partisanship, education, income, industry share, right? All of these are obviously to some extent impacted by the treatment itself, but it's kind of interesting that even controlling for them, you still find a pretty distinctive effect. And here is when I say controlling for present day production means still producing counties, and the same in places with no production anymore. And this is no production for the last 5 years, so it's pretty clear that the industry is gone, and the results are stable. Yes.
So I wonder if you could say, look at the people who were growing up during a period when oil was very important. So say, take the 70s or early 80s, and in places that were still drilling at the time, and if the people who were growing up around that time could be compared to others, age component, and whether that left them with a stronger sense of attachment.
Yeah, so what I do, tell me if that corresponds, is that actually I do something similar when thinking about, so here we're looking at alternative channels, and the one question is, of course, migration. And what I'm looking at is actually the decades of oil that happen after you arrive to a place, or after you're born in a place. And in kind of a pure selection dimension, if people would come to these places with a set of beliefs that are actually not impacted by the experience of the place, you wouldn't see this showing up, and you actually do. So to some extent, yes, but I could compare those that are when it's more salient, not just whether it's happening or not, but not sure I would mention that, right? Because you're at 70s, 80s, very salient period. Here is comparing just whether there is been extraction or not after, right?
I guess I was talking more about like the intensive project. So what's the driver of this?
So you mean you mean the exact time period, or when in someone's lifetime is actually important?
Well, given that a lot of people sort of form their a lot of their beliefs during, say, the
Mhm.
formative
Okay,
years.
yeah, the impressionable years, yeah. That I find I mean, no, it doesn't matter what time exactly the thing happens. Again, because if you think about the treatment that we're looking at here, it's not a sudden shock that you experience. It's a general cultural environment or just some signs in the place you're living in that are reminding you and that are kind of socializing you into having a positive thinking in the industry. So in a sense that makes sense.
Find your gender differences? Or-
I find it a bit to be stronger with men, my effect, which can be understood in the sense of, in general, women have much higher or significantly higher beliefs in attitudes towards climate change. There's a very interesting gender dimension that I'm not exploiting in this paper, or knowing how much the kind of, in a more qualitative fashion, how much the oil industry and the whole adventure has been tied to very masculine type of.
But did you interact decades of exposure to gender? Or
What I think I did
just
split
gender,
sample.
just a coefficient of-
Yeah, so I split the sample between men and women. Okay, here what I want to show, especially given that I don't have too much time, but I want to show something that I think is pretty silly or helping understand it's really specific to the story I'm saying. So here I'm mentioning, I just look at the fracking revolution as kind of a shock in present day production. And I think this is kind of, that's going back to the thing of, it might not be just economic dimensions, right? Because what I find using the fracking revolution as a nice exogenous shock is that it really impacts belief quite little. So it seems to be, even though it's obviously a very strong economic shock, positive economic shock. Now here I'm doing the same thing, but not, this is my main variable, but this is with different attitudes, social attitudes, and same with physical attitudes, with distribution, etc. And you see that it has very little effect. So it seems to be specific. It's not kind of a big ideology that oil and gas is creating. It seems to be specific to your beliefs about one thing, which is climate change. Okay, how are communities, fossil fuel communities different? Well, my answer, as I said, is oil identities, which I define as a sense of individual community attachment toward the resource or the industry, and which can include or be summarized by a set of positive beliefs regarding the contribution of the industry. Very conveniently chosen quotes to kind of back that up. This is a community organizer in an oil and gas community saying, big oil, there's no such thing as big oil. It's all our friends and neighbors and people running our towns and supporting us. The oil industry is us. There's a lot of very funny anecdotal evidence, or at least I find it kind of quirky, of festivals around oil and gas, of businesses rebranding around it, of changes in children vocabulary that don't ask to be swinged on their ways, but to be pumped like an oil well on the face. So just signs of an appropriation of the industry, call it an identity or not, and there's of course kind of theoretical reason to believe this is happening. How do I proxy for that quantitatively? I use the case of sports teams in the US, which, as you might know, is an important element of local cultures, right? Virtually all places in the US have teams, sports teams, whether amateur, pro, high school, etc. And those teams take name. You know, the Boston Celtics, you know, the Pittsburgh Steelers. Well, what I've learned working on this is that for 40 years, when the NFL team of Houston was still in Houston, they moved to Tennessee, they were the Oilers. They moved to Tennessee, they became the Tennessee Titans because it didn't make that much sense to be the Oilers of Houston, of Tennessee. But in fact, if you look at local newspapers pages of like sports team results, you see a lot of those Oilers teams. And it's great because actually newspapers is something we can use and that I scrape to kind of in a search for those, not the main ones which are obviously discussed everywhere, but for those local, unimportant, if you want, teams. And indeed, what you find is that after oil is found in the place, again, just controlling for places that were unsuccessful or not, over time, not immediately, but over time, the probability that you have sports teams that are named Oilers is increasing. Now, okay, let's try. This is a kind of a nice first step into seeing this happening. How have they been created? my story, or at least something I've tried to push, and it's also convenient for the last part of the paper, is to really think about oil companies being providers of public goods. And if you think it's also a way to tie it to why national identity are rising, in part it's related to the state provision of public good, right? And here, in fact, in those places, as this quote is stating, this was happening a lot, and this was often perceived as a positive thing, even though, of course, they are very strategic dimension for the oil and gas industry to do it. They need to lease the land, to hire the workers. They need to exist with this vast amount of wealth in places that have that don't have often that much privilege, but it's perceived as a nice thing, as this person says. We've got tons of different oil field companies that have been started by people who grew around here, and they just want what's best for the people that they've been working with, right? Whatever they can do for the community, they are great community-minded people. And one thing that they do, which we can measure, of course, you cannot capture everything, but one thing that they do, which is kind of nice, is that companies organize a lot of social events. They organize picnics, they sponsor conferences. And these are all things that are advertised also in the newspapers. And the good thing is, as I mentioned, I have the names of the companies extracting, even all those small companies that are doing the extraction, because in many cases, these are very small companies.
This is true for any sector of the economy, I would say.
Correct.
You know, in New York, you know, who finances the museums, you know, finance companies do that, the opera. So so I think that, and for, you know, for the same reasons as oil.
And I would be super interested in to see to what extent that indeed contributes to positive association with the industry. Right? At least in this case, so you see that indeed, again, this is a bit more like, it's not super surprising, but you see that this happens way more in places where oil and gas is actually being extracted. Makes sense. These are the companies that are doing it. And no, because I have like 1 minute left, I will just talk. I have other measures of, you know, local public finances changing. You see that tax revenues are extremely jumping when the oil is found. Local politicians are more likely to come from the industry, etc. So kind of, I'm documenting a bunch of things. You also see a lot of places being renamed. So you have Petroleum Mountain, Oil Creek, things like this. This is kind of to some extent descriptive. And in the last part, what I'm trying to think about is how can I really show that this is the vector of changing beliefs today? And here I'm using a variation that is in the industry size. And what I mean by this is that, so let's not get distracted by the slide. What you find is that depending on geological conditions, you can, as an individual, drill a well pretty easily and have your own oil and gas well in your field next to your farm. And that's great, you get a certain revenue. And some regions have a lot of these very small, by small, it's like 1 or 2 oil wells, firms extracting oil and gas. Other regions, for several reasons, whether property rights or, again, the geological conditions that ask for higher investment, you have firms that have 10, 20, 30 oil and gas wells, so bigger firms. And these are those that you would expect are doing this kind of public good provision. Right? These are those that are kind of in a relationship of nursing with the constituency. It's not just every individual farmer doing it. And indeed, so these are the measures I showed you before. This is the Congress members, etc. And indeed, it's in those places where the firms are bigger that you see more identities as proxied by oilers teams building up, and that you see by impact of decades of producing oil exploration being twice bigger. So these are places where the company size is above median. And you see that, again, there's not zero effect in other places because that's not the public provision is not the only possible channel of attachment, but this kind of seems to be pointing out towards.
And again, I'll question the identity part then. I think they're providing all these public goods and you're being sold an image or maybe an image, but also you're getting net benefits.
Yeah.
I don't want to say net benefits, you're getting benefits.
You're getting benefits, but if the industry is gone, it's the image you kind of stick to some extent, right? But maybe calling that identity is a bit too.
No, but you're saying that if it's gone and they're not providing any public goods anymore, then still.
Yes. Of course, I cannot, I can control for the presence of the
Where
industry.
do we see that in your regressions that
So-
it's gone?
So this is here. Because what I don't know that they're current public good provision, but what I know is whether, and I can define that in several. So this is the non-producing places for the last 5 years. This is true if I look at employment, not just production. This is true if I look at downstream industries presence and things like that.
Edgard, can you conclude?
Yes, let me wrap up, conclusion slide. And actually the conclusion I've said in the beginning. So conclusion slide is what I said. Probably this industry, but also other industries might have impacted climate change beliefs. And if you think about changing those beliefs, you probably want to think not just that the material dimensions that those beliefs are questioning, those statements about the climate are questioning, but also the cultural elements that they are questioning. And I think in all of our countries, we have cases of environmental regulation threatening some form of cultural developments or industries. And in fact, if you look at just the snapshot of beliefs around the world, what I find interesting is that with kind of a continent fixed effects, it is Venezuela, Norway, the Arabic Peninsula, etc., that display the lower beliefs. Of course, this is not ruling the present day, the kind of economic dimension, but it's kind of one step forward thinking into the application of that elsewhere. Thank you.